Chapter 3, The Psychology of Inspiration and of Imagination. It will have become apparent by now that the main object of this book is to consider what light the three subjects of history, language, and literature can be made to shed on each other. Now, there is one important respect in which the third of these subjects differs from either of the other two. It arises from the fact that poetry, in which literature as a whole had its origin, and which is still a kind of acronym for literature as a whole, is one of the arts. Thus, I began by pointing out that if interest in history as I defined it is itself of comparatively recent origin, consideration of the theory of history is more recent still. The latter part of this proposition, at least, will hardly be disputed, even if history itself is, after all, to be deemed as old as Herodotus, because what the Greeks achieved in the way of history is undoubtedly still important for us. There is nevertheless not much in what the Greeks thought about history, if there is anything at all, that remains relevant to our own ideas of it today. It is much the same with language. Although men were speaking and men were writing for millennia before the Greeks were heard of, no really systematic study of language was undertaken until a century or two ago. It is quite otherwise with theory of art. In this case, it is not only what the Greeks, for instance, achieved that is still valid. What they thought about it is also still relevant, if only because we can trace fairly easily the stages by which the kind of theory that is held today has developed from the kind of theories they formed. Aesthetic theory is very much older than either theory of history or theory of language. It has a long and significant past of its own. I shall try in this chapter to take a brief look at that past and see where it leads us, but I find I must begin by drawing attention to an important consideration that affects the history of any theory, and indeed the history of ideas in general. No matter what it is that the theories or ideas are about, namely, that there are two possible causes for people changing their ideas about anything as time goes on. One is that the thing has remained the same, but that people have come to think differently about it. A mistaken theory, for example, may be replaced by a more correct one, and the reverse is also possible. The other possible cause of a change of ideas is that the thing itself has changed in the meantime. To give a very crude example, looking at them as a whole, our ideas about the economics of transport and commerce have changed enormously in the last 100 years, partly, no doubt, because we have learned to form more efficiently mathematical ideas about anything that is calculable. We have developed the technique of logistics and other aids, but much more because transport itself and commerce with it has developed in the meantime, from a horse and buggy basis to a completely mechanized one. Our ideas and theories have had to change because the thing itself has changed out of all recognition. It is too often forgotten that when it is changing ideas about human consciousness itself we are looking at, or anything so intimately connected with that as artistic activity, the second cause is as likely to have predominated as the first. Ideas have changed because human consciousness itself, the elementary human experience about which the ideas are being formed, the whole relation between man and nature, or between conscious man and unconscious man, has itself been in the process of change. Indeed, I doubt if likely to have predominated is a strong enough way of putting it. If we think it through, I believe we shall find that it is mainly the second of the two causes we have to deal with here, and that this follows of necessity from the principle that words mean what they are generally used at any time to mean. In our time, when people think or write about art or the artist, the word that springs most readily to their minds is quote-unquote creative. In the expression, the creative artist, the epithet has become almost conventional, like the learned judge or the high-powered executive. And yet the first thing we find, if we look into the history of aesthetics at all, is that this idea, not just the word, but the idea it expresses, about the nature of art has been formed only very recently. You might say that although the key word itself was not yet used in the context of art, the idea first began to glimmer through in the 17th century. You certainly will not find it any further back. Let us accept the help offered by historical semantics by glancing at a few other such keywords and the ideas they express. Genius, for example, which we associate so closely with creativity. In this case, the association with aesthetics is much older, so that we can trace by stages a gradual development from an older meaning of something like a tutelary spirit to its modern meaning. The history of the word genius happens to be a case where the semantic approach to history is particularly fruitful, and much the same is true of one or two other words that have become so indispensable a part of the vocabulary of criticism. Words like original, imagination, invention. The current meanings of all these words have a long and important history. Genius will be found to have other etymological associations besides the ones I have touched on, including that of sexual potency. For a full treatment of it, the reader is again referred to R.B. Owen's Origins of European Thought, while the more recent histories of the other words in the domain of aesthetic theory were exhaustively considered by Logan Pearsall Smith in the long essay on 4 romantic words in his Words and Idioms. Rather than go into details, I want to indicate 2 particular features in the development of aesthetic theory from its beginning down to our own time, features which are certainly brought out sharply by the semantic approach, but which can then be confirmed without having recourse to it. We normally think of poetry as one of a number of arts, and so it is clear did Plato. But if we now go on to look at the kind of thing Plato said when he was talking about art in general, including poetry, but not limiting himself to it, and then at the kind of thing he said when he was talking about poetry only, we find a striking difference. In the first case, thinking of art in general or poetry merely as one among the other arts, he treats it as a form of mimesis, imitation. Thus, in the Republic, we are told that poets and artists in general are unreliable because they produce imperfect imitations or copies of nature. And Plato adds that since nature herself is only an imperfect copy of an eternal, immaterial reality, the poet is a man who supplies us with an imperfect copy of an imperfect copy. Now, one of the things we most certainly do if we want to trace the past history of the notion we now have of art as quote-unquote creative activity, it is to see how this other concept of mimesis changed and developed as time went on. Changed, for instance, when the Neoplatonists began insisting that it was not phenomenal nature which the true artist imitated, but the archetypical reality behind nature. So that, according to them, although the artist is an imitator, at least he is not, as Plato himself had feared, an imitator at second remove. In electrician's language, the artist stands not in series with nature, but in parallel with her. This view of the matter remained an influential and persistent one. We find Scaliger, for instance, in the 15th century, affirming that, quote, the poet maketh a new nature, and so maketh himself as it were a new God, end quote. Of course, he was only using a bold metaphor, especially in the second half of the sentence. But then we have seen that it is through the use of metaphor that meaning expands. We can indeed follow up this particular bit of meaning as it goes on expanding through the criticism of the Renaissance, and the doctrines of the Florentine Academy, and the writings of critics like Sir Philip Sidney in England, through the pre-Romantic stir in the 18th century and the Romantic ferment in England and Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries, down to our own time, when the mimetic function attributed to art has, so to speak, been developed away altogether or transformed into this new and possibly rather arrogant notion of creation as the artist's true function. The theory of mimesis, then, which is one of the sources of our notion of quote-unquote creativity, was certainly applied to poetry, and increasingly so as time went on. but it was applied to poetry only as one among the other arts. In fact, in the early stages of the development of the doctrine, the attention of those who were interesting themselves in it was directed more to the visual arts than to the poetic. In particular, it was concentrated on the problem of the surpassing excellence of Phidias's colossal statue of Zeus at Olympia, which is no longer extant. Thus, Dio Chrysostom in the 1st century AD represents Phidias as dealing with the difficulty that, quote, the same image has to be preserved unchanged in the mind of the artist until he has finished the statue, which may be a matter of years, end quote. In the following century, we have Philostratus speaking of imagination as, quote, an artist who carves what she has not seen, end quote. In the 3rd century AD, Plotinus is propounding the doctrine that, quote, the arts do not simply imitate what they see, but reascend to those principles, logoi, the plural of logos, from which nature herself is derived. Phidias used no visible model for his Zeus, end quote. We seem to see the concept of imitation growing before our eyes towards a doctrine of creation. But in the particular case of poetry, the art whose raw material is language, there was another parallel approach to the central aesthetic experience and activity, and it is here we must look for our other source of the psychology of creative imagination. It has often been remarked that in respite of his condemnation of poets in the Republic, there are other dialogues, the Ion and the Phaedrus, in which Plato speaks of the poet with a kind of reverent awe. In these other dialogues, he concerns himself rather with the psychology than the method of poetry. If we really want to study all that lies behind our current notion of the creativity of poets and artists, we have to follow up the history of this line of thought also and see how it was first developed and then finally developed away or transformed. The poetic psychology, that is, the view of the psychology of the poet, which was developed in this way, is of course the psychology of inspiration. It is the doctrine of mania, or divine madness, of enthusiasmos, of possession by a god or by the muses, and then of possession by a godling, whom the particular poet refers to as his muse, but in any case, possession by some spirit other than the poet's own individual ego. It was a very persistent psychology. It lived on, as E.R. Curtis puts it in his book, European Literature in the Latin Middle Ages, quote, through the entire millennium, which extends from the conquest of Rome by the Goths to the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks, lived on until the creative eros of the Italian Renaissance reawakened the spirit in the letter, end quote. We must say, therefore, that the history of poetic psychology is the story of a super-individual psychology which extends from as far back as can be investigated up to at least the Renaissance, but with reverberations still going on much later, and which only then begins to be transformed into something like an individual psychology. Then it becomes, or begins to become, a psychology of individual quote-unquote genius. And so the word genius changes its meaning. Originally, the genius was a spirit being other than the poet himself, though certainly with a special relation to the poet himself. But that is not what we mean by genius today. The Romans, for it is a Latin word, would never have said of a man that he is a genius. They would have said he had or was accompanied or inspired by a genius. We prefer to say that he is one. But do not we have to say that, however it may be with muses and genius, we do still take account of something like quote-unquote inspiration even today. It is still widely considered that what is operant in the poet or artist in the throes of creation is not quite himself in the ordinary everyday sense. Something like inspiration, yes, and that is the whole point. Coleridge, as usual, puts his finger on it, distinguishing implicitly between the old meaning of genius and the new, when in the Biographia Literaria he defines true genius as, quote, possessing the spirit, not possessed by it, end quote. To think of Coleridge is inevitably to think of the psychology of imagination. Everyone has heard of his distinction between imagination and fancy, and I need not go into it. But Coleridge serves to remind us that with the advent of the Romantic movement, or Romantic revival as it is significantly called, with the whole Romantic conception of art, we are passing finally from a psychology of inspiration to a psychology of imagination. Very much has been written about the nature of imagination. It has been pointed out, for instance, that, as the word itself suggests, it has to do with making of images. Images, for example, of nature, which are yet somehow more than mere copies or reproductions. Perhaps all our endeavors to say something fruitful about imagination can best be seen as a struggle to reject the old concept of inspiration and yet somehow retain it, to reject the old super-individual psychology, and at the same time to develop an individual psychology which is viable for the phenomenon of art, and which therefore has to differ sharply from the individual psychology of Hobbes, Locke, and Hume, has indeed to differ from that much more sharply than it differs from the older psychology of inspiration. It is felt, or it was until very recently, that both a super-individual and an individual view of the provenance of art are necessary and must somehow be combined, although they appear to be mutually exclusive. We get, in fact, a kind of polarity of contraries, which is closely analogous to the polarity between communication and expression that I have suggested underlies the nature of language. Finally, into all this ferment of aesthetic theory and its development, there has entered almost within living memory an entirely new leaven in the shape of the concept of an unconscious mind, or as it is sometimes called, the unconscious. I say almost within living memory because this concept of an unconscious mind, though still very young, is nevertheless very much older than Sigmund Freud. We find it, for instance, in the particular relation to the psychology of poetry in E.S. Dallas's book, The Gay Science, published in 1866. Dallas has a whole chapter on what he calls the hidden soul, and he reminds us there that even such a thoroughgoing Victorian positivist as Herbert Spencer was obliged to postulate this unconscious kind of consciousness, for that is what we really mean when we speak of, quote, the unconscious, end quote. Spencer indeed put the matter quite badly and baldly and uncompromisedly when he wrote the sentence Dallas quotes, quote, mysterious as seems the consciousness of something which is yet out of consciousness, we are obliged to think it, end quote. The whole pre-Freudian development of the notion of mental activities of which we are unconscious and which merge with the life forces in us is usefully traced in Lancelot White's book, The Unconscious Before Freud. Broadly, then, this historical transition from a psychology of inspiration to one of imagination is best seen as the transition from a view of art, which beholds it as the product of a mind, or spirit, not possessed by the individual, but rather possessing him, to a view of it as the product of something in a manner possessed by the individual, though still not identical with his everyday personality, possessed by him, whether as his genius, or as his shaping spirit of imagination, or his unconscious mind, or whatever name we prefer to give it, his own, but not himself. Here the question inevitably arises of the relation between this quote-unquote super-individual consciousness and what is commonly but quite unpicturably called instinct. Coleridge, for example, in his Biographia Literaria, speaks of, quote, an interpretation of spontaneous impulse and voluntary purpose," end quote. Earlier in the same work, he affirms that only those who possess imagination in the deepest sense, quote, "who feel in their own spirits the same instinct which impels the chrysalis of the horned fly to leave room in its involucrum for antennae yet to come, they know and feel that the potential works in them, even as the actual works on them," end quote. It would, however, be a grievous error to equate these master currents below the surface with the concept of instinct as it has been developed within the straitjacket of post-Darwinian biological theory. On the contrary, quote, "that which lies on the other side of our natural consciousness," end quote, "is precisely the spiritual in man." Elsewhere, Coleridge himself deals specifically with the whole problem of instinct, and in order to understand what he means, we must first have acquainted ourselves with his general theory of life. For a similar reason, the few remarks I shall venture on the subject myself are best deferred to my final chapter. There is another difference between the two psychologies we must notice. Whereas the older one of inspiration is fundamentally passive as far as an individual's mind is concerned, the psychology of imagination is fundamentally active. It is normally assumed by us today that the individual poet has to do something in order to create poetry. As to exactly what he has to do and with what part of himself, there is little agreement. Not only do theories differ, but the actual experience of one poet differs widely from that of another, if we are to judge by their own accounts of it. Look at the little paperback called The Creative Process, in which Brewster Gislin has assembled a number of such accounts, but all seem to agree that he has to do something, even the extreme view that all he has to do is get out of the way to surrender himself unreservedly to his genius or his imagination or his unconscious or whatever he calls it, comes under this heading. We are left in no doubt that this surrender of the self is a positive act and even a very difficult one to achieve. What happens is something very different from what happens to Virgil's Cumean Sibyl when the divine Afflatus descended on her and she shrieked aloud, "Deus ecce Deus." If I am right in the suggestion I made at the beginning that this is a case where the change in theory cannot have been merely a dialectical progress, merely a case of growing accuracy in the observation of the same data, but that it must reflect a change in the data themselves, then we must say that what we have before us when we look at artistic or poetic activity historically is an actual transition from one kind of event to another kind. It is a transition from the being taken hold of by something, some force or being or some element of not self, without any personal effort on the part of the poet, to an active taking hold of something by the poet, a producing and animating or reanimating of something within himself, which only his personal effort can make available to him. The content of his poetry changes from something that is, quote unquote, given to something that has to be actively grasped or achieved. Does this contrast between a given and an achieved mental content remind us of anything? Well, it reminds me very definitively of that contrast to which attention was drawn in the first chapter between the lexical meaning and the speaker's meaning of a word. The lexical meaning, or norm, it will be recalled, is already given in the language, which the individual speaker finds available to him. But over against this is the speaker's meaning, which he may or may not produce from himself or achieve somehow in employing that language. But there is another resemblance also. In both cases, if we look at the matter historically, if we look back into the past, which is what we can do with the help of the semantic approach, instead of looking only back onto it. So into it versus onto it. And if we do this looking without any preconceived notions derived from other disciplines, then all we can see is the transition from the former to the latter, from the given to the achieved, or at least the possibility of achievement. In the case of inspiration and imagination, that transition has been the topic of the present chapter. In the case of language, or rather of meaning, in considering the true nature of imagery and metaphor, we previously observed an overall contraction of lexical meaning leading to an expansion produced by the impact on it of an individual speaker's meaning. Now, in the case of history, in the case of the history of meaning, attention was further drawn to the fact that historical linguistic theory, that is, etymological theory, and especially the theories characteristic of the 19th and early 20th centuries, has chosen to step outside this fairly simple framework. The theory, for instance, of a quote-unquote metaphorical period having occurred at some point in prehistory is the dogma. It is a dogma for semantics, whatever it may be for anthropology or for biology, that these quote-unquote given lexical meanings had been produced or achieved at a still earlier age in the form of speaker's meaning. Whereas the study of language itself tells us only that speaker's meaning is always preceded by lexical meaning. And so it is with inspiration and imagination. Actual historical study of poetry and of changing ideas about poetry lead us back through the centuries from a period characterized by imagination to a period characterized by inspiration. There is nothing in that study itself that can take us back any further or to anything else. But here again, by choosing to import theories drawn from other disciplines altogether, Comte's positivist interpretation of history, for instance, many, or perhaps most, are led to assume that the period of inspiration was itself preceded by a prehistoric ebullience of imagination. The super-individual psychology of inspiration was, we are told, or rather we are not often told, it is assumed, we shall take it for granted, the invention of a number of anonymous, prehistoric, individual poets or philosophers or scientists or neurotics. Not only poetry, but also its predecessor, myth, was, in the first place, the product not of inspiration, but of imagination. The concept of myth and the concept of poetry as the product of inspiration are very closely allied. And so lastly, in the theory associated especially with the name of Max Muller, we find the two dogmas of prehistory, the one about language and the one about myth, actually coalescing in his definition of myth as a disease of language. According to Muller, not only did the so-called immaterial language or figurative language arise in the first place by way of metaphor, but the myths themselves only arose when those metaphors were by mistake taken literally. We do not, of course, know who first made that sort of mistake, but we know that a time came when everybody was making it. Here, then, we have a good example of one of those mysterious mistakes in the use of language, which everyone somehow makes at the same time. But as has already been pointed out, we know better than that today. We know now that language can only mean just what it is employed to mean, so that the idea of a universal mistake in the use of language is a non-starter. Let us, in conclusion, go back for a moment to history in general, but now also to prehistory. There was Collingwood's dictum that, quote, all real history is history of thought, end quote, which is itself based on the sharp distinction he draws between a historical event and a natural one, and so between all history and all nature. It was in this connection that he gave his instance of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Again, without pausing yet to examine the whole of what he says or to consider how far we can accept it, we must agree, I think, that the distinction between history and nature is an important one to make, if we hope to think about either of the two with any degree of precision. The distinction is just as important whether or not as metaphysicians, we will go on afterwards to resolve it. The existence of anything we can properly call history does involve the presence in or at the back of the relevant events of some sort of conscious human intention, and therefore of some degree of individual quote-unquote thought, or of thoughts entertained by an individual mind. Caesar had such individual thoughts when he crossed the Rubicon. It may be that history can take us back to the events intentionally brought about by human beings very much less individualized than Caesar, very much less capable of what we now understand by thinking. But some degree of it you must have before you come up to a period in the past which you can talk about at all under the rubric of history. Anything before that would come under the heading of nature. If we liked, we could substitute for the term quote-unquote historical period the term period during which some events were determined by individual thought. If, for instance, you care to suppose a remote period when sounds were uttered by Homo sapiens purely for the purpose of expression and without any supervening element of communication, it would be nature you were talking about. Possibly an evolving nature, but still nature, not history. And conversely, as soon as you have individual thinkers, you have reached a period which is properly characterized as historical in the wide sense, or if no records are available, then at least prehistorical. Clearly, it was during the prehistoric period that both language and myth developed. Clearly, therefore, the prehistoric period emerged immediately from something we are only justified in calling nature, just as later the historical period itself emerged immediately from the prehistoric. Yet here too, the kind of theory I have been engaged in criticizing in the realm of language and aesthetic involves, in the case of history, a sort of leapfrogging movement backwards and forwards at the same time. We are kept on the rails to some extent with the origin of quote-unquote history, because we have the written records to guide us, however much we may misinterpret them. When we come to the origin of prehistory, then as far as the psychology of it is concerned, we have mainly speculation. Yet one would have thought that at least we should go on assuming its emergence from nature and not from the history, which only comes after it. Nature as such involves the absence, just as history as such involves the presence of individual human activity as distinct from quote-unquote instinctive behavior. But if we maintain, or if we imagine or suppose, which is perhaps the commoner feeling, that such phenomena as language and myth are themselves the product of individual human activity, individual human intention, then we are premising psychologically that prehistory emerged not from nature, but from a still earlier historical period, a supposititious period when existentially individualized human beings, not altogether unlike Julius Caesar's, thought and imagined and invented and repressed and suffered from neuroses and did a whole lot of other things which are in fact only possible and really only conceivable of the historical period.